The courthouse stood tall and imposing against the morning sky, its stone walls echoing decades of trials, verdicts, and untold stories. Inside, the atmosphere was thick with quiet tension, as though the very air carried the weight of justice. The polished wooden floors reflected the dim glow of overhead lights, while every footstep, every cough, every shuffle of papers seemed magnified in the silence. On this particular morning, the courtroom was fuller than usual. Jurors had been summoned early, their expressions betraying a mixture of weariness and solemn responsibility. Some sat upright, attentive, while others leaned back in their seats, mentally preparing for the long day ahead. The attorneys at their respective tables whispered to one another, arranging stacks of documents and preparing arguments. Every so often, one of them glanced at the clock on the wall, as if measuring the pace of justice by its ticking hands. The judge, a man with graying hair and a stern face carved by years of presiding over difficult cases, sat at the bench reviewing notes. His glasses perched low on his nose as his eyes scanned through files, his pen tapping rhythmically against the wood. Though silent, his presence alone demanded respect. Everyone in the room seemed to breathe more carefully when his gaze lifted, wary of disturbing the order he commanded. Among the suited professionals, the officers in uniform, and the quiet jurors, one pair stood out: the young mother and her little girl. They had slipped into a bench near the back of the courtroom, as unobtrusive as possible. The mother looked nervous, though not because of the case itself. She knew her daughter's presence might draw unwanted attention. She whispered to the child, urging her to stay still, her voice soft yet firm. The girl, however, seemed untouched by the seriousness around her. Only 3 years old, she swung her legs beneath the bench, the tips of her shoes barely brushing the floor. Her big brown eyes roamed the room with curiosity, absorbing the tall ceilings, the rows of polished benches, the strange, solemn faces of strangers. To her, it wasn't a room of justice. It was simply a new place, filled with people, sounds, and possibilities. The girl's small hand gripped her mother's sleeve as she leaned close and whispered, questions in a voice too soft for others to hear. "Why is everyone so quiet? Why is that man sitting up there?" Her mother smiled faintly, shushing her gently, but inside she worried. She had brought her daughter because there had been no one to leave her with at home. She hoped the child would blend into the background, unnoticed. After all, courtrooms were no place for children. But children have a way of making themselves known. From the front rows, some jurors occasionally turned their heads, noticing the little girl. A few softened at the sight, as though reminded of their own families, their own children waiting at home. Others frowned slightly, perhaps thinking the courtroom wasn't the right environment for a toddler. Yet, despite the stares, the girl remained in her own world, swinging her legs, brushing her fingers against the smooth wood of the bench, and staring intently at anyone who walked past. The prosecution and defense teams carried on with their quiet preparations, seemingly oblivious to the child. But if anyone had looked closely, they might have noticed how the smallest person in the room was watching more carefully than most of the adults. Her eyes followed every movement, her ears perked at every sound. It was as if her natural innocence gave her a sharper awareness, one that cut through the tension rather than being dulled by it. Minutes passed, each one slow and heavy. The bailiff adjusted his stance by the door. The murmur of whispers between attorneys filled the air. Someone in the gallery coughed, and the sound bounced off the walls. The judge cleared his throat, immediately silencing even the whispers. He looked up, eyes scanning the room, ensuring all was in order. The mother instinctively tightened her arm around her daughter, silently praying the girl would stay calm. She knew how unpredictable a 3-year-old could be. One sudden outburst, one loud question, and the quiet of the courtroom could shatter like glass. She whispered again, "Please, sweetheart, be still." The child nodded, her lips pursed as though she understood, though her eyes still wandered, curious and alert. And so the room waited. The case they were about to hear was not ordinary. It involved evidence that had been carefully collected and disputed, witnesses whose testimony could shift the direction of justice, and a truth that everyone hoped would finally come to light. The atmosphere was heavy with anticipation, but beneath it all, there was an undercurrent of something no one could name, a sense that something unusual was about to happen. The girl fidgeted, tugging slightly at the ribbon in her hair, her gaze fixed on the heavy doors at the side of the courtroom. She couldn't explain why, but she felt drawn to them. She didn't know what they hid, who might walk through them, or why her small chest tightened with excitement. She only knew that those doors mattered. Her mother noticed her staring and whispered again, "Don't worry about that. Just stay close to me." The girl nodded, but kept her eyes forward. For the adults, the next moment was merely the expected start of another trial. For the little girl, however, it would be the beginning of something extraordinary. When the bailiff finally stepped forward to announce the arrival of a key officer and his companion, the room prepared itself for routine. But the child sat up straighter, her small body trembling with anticipation. She didn't understand the law, she didn't know the arguments, but she sensed something no one else did. Innocence, after all, has a way of seeing truth before anyone else can. And in that solemn courtroom, where silence reigned and justice seemed heavy, it was the eyes of a child that saw what no one expected. Her voice, still unspoken, carried the weight of a revelation that would soon stun everyone. The stage was set. The jurors were ready. The judge was prepared. The attorneys sharpened their arguments. Yet unknowingly, every adult in the room was about to take a step back, as a 3-year-old girl stood poised to become the center of the story. She did not know it yet. Neither did her mother. Neither did the officer approaching the door with his loyal companion at his side. But fate was seconds away from being written into that courtroom's history. The courtroom had settled into its rhythm. Papers shuffled, pens clicked, and whispers faded into quiet concentration as the case prepared to proceed. To most, the little girl seated with her mother remained nothing more than a passing curiosity, reminder of how life often intrudes even into places meant for solemnity. But what no one realized was that she would soon step out of the background and into the heart of the moment. She was not a witness. She had not been called, sworn in, or even acknowledged by the court. She was simply there because circumstances had forced her mother to bring her. And yet, children rarely remain invisible, no matter how much the adults around them hope they will. Her mother sat stiffly, hands folded tightly in her lap, shoulders tense with unspoken prayers that her daughter would stay quiet. Every time the girl shifted, every time her little shoes tapped against the bench, the mother's heart jumped, as though fearing the sound alone might break courtroom decorum. The girl, however, was fascinated. To her young eyes, the courtroom was not heavy with rules and consequences. It was a stage. The tall wooden bench where the judge sat seemed like a throne. The lawyers, with their dark suits and stern expressions, looked like characters from one of the bedtime stories she half understood. The jurors, arranged neatly in their box, were an audience that watched silently, just like she did. She tugged gently at her mother's sleeve. "Why is he sitting up so high?" she whispered, pointing discreetly at the judge. Her mother shook her head quickly, pressing a finger to her lips. She just listened. But the child frowned. "He looks grumpy," she muttered, making her mother flush red with embarrassment. A man sitting 2 benches ahead turned slightly, catching the whisper, and despite himself, a smile tugged at the corner of his lips. The sight of innocence in such a serious place softened him, if only for a second. Yet the mother leaned close to her daughter, whispering firmly, "Please, sweetheart, you must be quiet." Promise me." The girl's eyes widened, and she nodded solemnly. "I promise." Promises from toddlers, however, were fragile things. As the attorneys began their opening remarks, the child fidgeted. Her promise to be still lasted only minutes before curiosity overtook her again. She traced patterns on the bench with her fingertip, examined the buttons on her dress, and peeked over her shoulder at the strangers seated behind her. Each time her mother gently pulled her back into place, offering reassuring pats. But the girl was not restless in the way most children were. She was observant. Her gaze moved from person to person, lingering on details the adults ignored. She noticed the way the bailiff's hand never left the radio clipped to his belt, as if he expected it to buzz at any moment. She studied how one juror tapped her foot beneath her chair, almost imperceptibly, betraying nerves she tried to hide. She saw how another juror's hands stayed clenched together, fingers ringing silently in her lap. To the child, all these little things mattered. She could not put them into words, but she felt them. Where the adults saw routine, she sensed tension. Where the grown-ups prepared themselves for arguments and evidence, she prepared herself for something. Her eyes kept drifting back to the large double doors on the far side of the room. They fascinated her. She had never seen doors so tall, so heavy, and so mysterious. She could tell everyone was waiting for something to come through them. Her tiny heart thudded with anticipation, though she did not understand why. "Mommy," she whispered again, tugging insistently at her mother's sleeve. Her mother hushed her without looking, eyes fixed on the lawyers at the front. "Not now. But what's behind those doors?" the girl asked. Her whisper was small, but her voice carried enough that the man 2 benches ahead twitched again, stifling another smile. Her mother gave her a warning look that said everything, not another word. The little girl puffed her cheeks in frustration, but she obeyed, at least for the moment. To the court, she remained background noise. None of the officials considered that her eyes were sharper than theirs, her innocence unclouded by procedure or prejudice. She was not bound by the rules of the courtroom, nor by the heavy expectations of justice. She was free to see the world exactly as it appeared. And sometimes, truth reveals itself most clearly through innocent eyes. Minutes stretched like hours. The defense attorney stood, his voice measured, presenting his version of events. His words were calm, but edged with determination, and the jurors scribbled notes dutifully. The prosecutor watched silently, already planning his rebuttal. The judge listened, unmoving, though his tapping pen betrayed his restlessness. But the little girl heard none of it. Her attention had left the lawyers entirely. Instead, her eyes stayed fixed on the door. Her breathing quickened every time it creaked, as if she somehow knew that the story of the day was not in the papers on the attorneys' desks or the notes in the judge's file. It was waiting beyond those doors, about to walk in. Her mother, noticing the way her daughter stiffened with anticipation, frowned in confusion. What could a child possibly sense that the rest of them did not? She leaned close again, whispering, "What is it? Why are you staring there?" The girl blinked and whispered back, "Something important." Her mother exhaled in frustration, brushing it off as childish imagination. Still, the girl could not look away. The longer she stared, the more her small body tensed, until she sat upright on the bench, eyes wide, as if waiting for the curtain to rise on the most important scene of her life. To everyone else, she looked like a fidgety toddler. To her, she was waiting for fate to step into the room. And fate, as it turned out, was only moments away. What no one expected was that when the door finally opened, it would not be the lawyers, the judge, or the jurors who reacted first. It would be her, the child who was not meant to be part of the trial, the girl who was supposed to sit silently in the background. She was, in every sense, an unexpected witness. For in just a few breaths, her small voice would rise above all the others. And with it, she would bring the courtroom to a standstill. The courtroom had been wrapped in a strange rhythm, lawyers presenting, jurors scribbling, and the quiet authority of the judge overseeing it all. But just as the words of the defense attorney began to settle into a steady drone, the heavy wooden doors creaked open, drawing every eye in the room. In stepped a uniformed officer, tall and commanding, his badge gleaming faintly under the lights. But it wasn't the officer who held the room's attention. At his side, moving with precise steps and undeniable presence, was a German shepherd. The click of the dog's nails against the polished floor echoed like a drumbeat, instantly resetting the atmosphere. The canine was more than just an animal. He was a figure of discipline, strength, and authority. His coat, a blend of tan and black, shone under the lights, and his dark, intelligent eyes scanned the room. He walked with the proud confidence of a creature who had been trained to obey, protect, and serve. The officer kept a steady hand on the leash, guiding him toward the witness stand. A hush fell across the room, as though the arrival of the dog marked a new phase of the trial. Jurors shifted forward in their seats. Some, clearly fascinated, leaned in to get a better look at the animal they had heard about, but not yet seen. Others stiffened slightly, the dog's presence a reminder of both danger and protection. Even the judge, who had presided over countless cases, allowed his gaze to linger on the animal. The canine unit was a respected tool of justice, but rarely did one become such a central figure in a courtroom. The dog moved flawlessly beside his handler, head high, tail still, ears erect. Every ounce of him radiated discipline. And yet, for one person in the room, the moment was far more than an official demonstration. On the wooden bench near the back, the little girl froze. Her tiny body stiffened, her legs stopped swinging, and her wide eyes locked on the dog. She didn't blink. She didn't move. It was as though the rest of the courtroom melted away, and only that dog existed. Her mother noticed instantly. She whispered urgently, "Sweetheart, sit still. Don't stare." But the child didn't respond. Her gaze was transfixed. She recognized him. At first, she couldn't understand why her heart pounded so fast, or why her throat felt tight. To her, it wasn't a police canine stepping into a courtroom. It was someone she knew. The shape of his ears, the way he held his head, even the pattern of fur across his chest. These details weren't new to her. They were memories. The girl's lips parted, trembling as though trying to form a word she had not spoken in years. She leaned forward on the bench, eyes wide, breath quick. Her small fingers clutched her mother's sleeve so tightly that her knuckles turned white. The dog's paws tapped rhythmically against the floor as he passed by, his focus fixed ahead. He did not look at her. His training was strict, his obedience unwavering. To him, a courtroom was a place of seriousness, not reunion. But the child's heart told her otherwise. She whispered, barely audible, "Buddy." Her mother's eyes widened. "What did you say?" She hissed, pulling her close. "Buddy?" the girl repeated, a little louder this time, her voice trembling with certainty. Her eyes never left the dog. Her mother shook her head frantically. No. Don't. Stay quiet." She tried to hush her, but the girl's small body was practically shaking now. Tears welled in her eyes as the memories crashed back, memories of a warm tongue on her cheek, of soft fur beneath her fingers, of a loyal companion who used to sleep at the foot of her bed. Memories of a best friend who had vanished without a trace. The German shepherd walked forward, still oblivious. His leash tightened slightly as the officer guided him toward the front. The rest of the courtroom followed with interest, completely unaware of the storm brewing in one child's heart. The girl couldn't hold it in any longer. She suddenly stood on the bench, her little arm stretched out, her finger pointing directly at the dog. Her voice, high and clear, broke the silence. "Buddy!" The sound cut through the courtroom like thunder. Every head turned. The officer stopped in his tracks, confused by the sudden outburst. The jurors froze, pens midder. Even the judge leaned forward, brows furrowing. The little girl stood tall, her face flushed with emotion, her eyes wide and shining with tears. She wasn't just calling out a name. She was calling out to him. The dog's ears twitched. For the first time since entering the room, his head turned not toward the officer, not toward the judge, but toward the small voice that had called him. His dark eyes locked on the child at the back of the courtroom. His body stiffened, as though some deep memory stirred inside him. The handler frowned, tightening his grip on the leash. "Stay," he commanded firmly. But the dog's attention was broken. His tail gave the slightest twitch. His eyes softened. The girl cried out again, louder this time, her voice ringing with desperate joy. "Buddy!" Gasps spread through the courtroom. People turned to one another, whispering in confusion. Who was this child? How did she know the dog's name? And why was the disciplined canine suddenly ignoring his training? The officer tugged at the leash again, but the dog took a small step toward the girl. His ears perked higher, his tail wagged once, then twice. He let out a soft, almost imperceptible whine, the kind of sound no handler could train out of him. The courtroom sat frozen in disbelief. The mother, red with panic, tried to pull her daughter back onto the bench. "Stop it! Sit down!" she whispered harshly. But the girl shook her head stubbornly, her voice cracking as she cried out again, "Buddy, it's me!" The dog pulled against the leash. His training faltered under the weight of recognition. And at that moment, the atmosphere in the courtroom shifted entirely. No one cared about the legal arguments anymore. No one listened to the attorneys. All eyes were locked on the bond between a child and a dog, a bond that had survived separation, distance, and even the rigid training of a canine program. For years, the little girl's family had mourned the loss of their beloved pet. For years, the dog had served under a new name, with a new duty. But in that instant, two worlds collided. And all it took was two small words. "Buddy." For a moment, time seemed to stop inside the courtroom. The stern voices of attorneys, the scribbling of jurors, the steady authority of the judge, all of it vanished into silence as the little girl stood tall on the wooden bench. Her tiny frame trembled, her cheeks flushed with a mixture of fear and determination, and yet her voice rang out with clarity that no one could ignore. "Buddy!" The single word echoed through the chamber, bouncing off the high ceilings and polished walls. It was not just a name, it was a cry of recognition, a call pulled from the deepest corners of memory. Every head turned. Jurors shifted in their seats, wide-eyed, trying to make sense of what had just happened. The attorneys, mid-thought, froze as if their tongues had turned to stone. Even the judge leaned forward slightly, his stern expression betraying a flicker of curiosity. It was not every day a toddler disrupted the proceedings, and certainly not like this. The mother's face burned red with panic. She pulled at her daughter's arm, trying to lower her back onto the seat. "Sit down now," she hissed, her voice sharp and desperate. But the child resisted, her small hands gripping the edge of the bench, her finger pointing unwaveringly at the German shepherd at the front of the courtroom. "Buddy!" she cried again, louder this time, her voice filled with joy and certainty. The officer holding the leash stiffened. His brows furrowed as he glanced down at the dog, then back at the girl. The name she had called wasn't random. It wasn't generic, like doggy or puppy. It was specific. And more unsettling than that, the dog had reacted. The German shepherd's ears twitched again, his head snapping toward the sound of the girl's voice. For an instant, His rigid training seemed to vanish. The steady, composed posture of a canine officer was replaced by something softer, almost human in its recognition. His tail gave another faint wag, and he let out a quiet whine. The handler's grip on the leash tightened. "Stay," he ordered firmly, his voice commanding. The dog froze, torn between duty and instinct. But the little girl wasn't done. She leaned forward as far as her tiny body would allow, her finger trembling as she pointed directly at him. "That's Buddy." "It's him, Mommy." "It's really him." Gasps rippled across the courtroom. The gallery broke into murmurs, people whispering to one another in disbelief. Some leaned forward to get a better look. Others shook their heads as though convinced the child must be mistaken. The judge's gavel came down sharply. "Order in the court," he barked, his deep voice cutting through the chaos. The murmurs died instantly, but the tension remained. His eyes, stern and unyielding, shifted toward the officer and the dog. "Proceed with the demonstration," he instructed. Yet even his tone carried a thread of curiosity. The handler nodded quickly, giving the leash a tug to move forward. The dog obeyed, taking a step toward the witness stand, but his eyes never left the child. And then, something happened that no one expected. The dog stopped. He planted his paws firmly against the polished floor, refusing to move another step. His tail, once rigid, wagged in steady, deliberate arcs. His eyes softened, glistening as they locked onto the little girl who still stood on the bench, calling for him. "Buddy," she whispered now, her voice breaking into a sob. The officer tugged harder. "Heel," he commanded, but the German shepherd disobeyed. He whined loudly this time, pulling against the leash, his entire body straining toward the child. The courtroom erupted in gasps. A trained canine breaking discipline was no small thing. These dogs were selected for their obedience, their ability to remain focused even in chaos. But this one was pulling, desperate, as though the little girl's voice had broken through every command ever drilled into him. The mother's hands shook as she tried to hold her daughter back. "Please, sit down," she begged, tears welling in her own eyes, now not from embarrassment, but from fear of what might happen. She knew her daughter wasn't lying. She knew the truth behind the name she had spoken. But the thought of it being real, of this impossibility standing before her, was too much to bear. The judge raised his gavel again, but even he hesitated. This was no ordinary disruption. His eyes flicked between the child, the dog, and the handler, as though trying to piece together the puzzle. "Sir," one of the jurors whispered to another, unable to stop themselves. Did she say the dog's name? How could she know that? The whispers grew again, despite the judge's warning. The story was too extraordinary, the possibility too strange. And then the dog broke free. With a sudden, powerful tug, the German shepherd slipped the handler's grip and bolted across the courtroom. Gasps turned into shouts as the animal sprinted toward the back benches. The mother screamed, pulling her daughter close in instinctive fear. But the girl broke free, her face glowing with joy as tears streamed down her cheeks. "Buddy!" she cried, her arms outstretched. The dog leapt forward, skidding to a stop at the bench, and pressed his massive head against her tiny chest. His tail wagged furiously, his tongue licking her face as she laughed and sobbed at once. The disciplined canine officer had vanished, replaced by the beloved family pet who had been missing for years. The courtroom was chaos. Some cried, some laughed, some simply stared in disbelief. The officer rushed forward, shouting commands, but the dog ignored him completely. For the first time in years, he had found what he had lost, and no amount of training could pull him away. The little girl buried her face in his fur, sobbing uncontrollably. "I knew it was you," she whispered. "I knew it." Her mother collapsed to her knees beside them, tears spilling down her face. She reached out, running her trembling hands through the dog's coat, recognizing every familiar detail. "It's him," she whispered through her sobs. "It's really him." The judge sat frozen, his gavel still in hand but unused. His courtroom had descended into something beyond order or law. It had become a place of reunion, of revelation, of something so human it defied the very structure of justice. And all of it had been sparked by a tiny finger pointing across the room, and two simple words that carried the weight of a family's lost love. "Buddy." The rest of the trial would wait. The law, for a moment, would wait. Because everyone in that room knew they were witnessing something that reached far beyond procedure. They were witnessing a miracle. The courtroom was no longer a courtroom. For years it had been a chamber of order, where facts were dissected, testimonies weighed, and justice measured in precise scales. But in that moment, as the German shepherd broke his leash of discipline and pressed himself against the chest of a sobbing 3-year-old girl, the room transformed into something else entirely. It became a stage for shock, disbelief, and a reunion that no law could have predicted. Gasps filled the air, overlapping with murmurs that rippled through the gallery like waves. Some people covered their mouths in astonishment. Others leaned forward so far in their benches that they seemed about to fall. A few jurors blinked hard, as though trying to confirm they weren't dreaming. The judge's gavel slammed once, twice, the sharp cracks reverberating through the chamber. "Order, order in the court." His voice was stern, commanding, but it carried a tremor. Even he could not hide that he had been shaken by what he had just witnessed. The officer, red-faced and breathless, hurried after the dog, grabbing at the leash that now hung loose. "Sit, stay," he barked, his commands sharp, drilled from years of training. But the dog did not obey. Instead, the proud K9, who only minutes earlier had entered the courtroom with perfect composure, was wagging his tail uncontrollably, whining softly, and licking the child's face with desperate affection. The girl clung to him, her little arms wrapping tightly around his thick neck, burying her face into his fur. Tears streamed down her cheeks, but they were not tears of fear. They were tears of joy. "It's Buddy," she whispered over and over. "It's really Buddy." The mother knelt beside her, trembling so violently she could hardly form words. She reached out, touching the dog's back with hesitant fingers. The familiar softness of his fur, the warmth of his body, the way he nuzzled against her daughter, every detail was the same as the pet they had lost 2 years ago. Her lips parted, her voice breaking. "Oh my God, it's him. It's really him." The officer froze, his grip slackening on the leash. He looked at the mother, then the child, then the dog at his feet, and his stern mask cracked into confusion. How do you know his name?" he asked hoarsely, his voice unsteady. The mother shook her head in disbelief, tears welling in her eyes. "Because we gave it to him. He was our dog. He was our buddy, and he disappeared from our yard 2 years ago." The courtroom erupted again. Gasps, whispers, heads shaking in disbelief. A juror covered her mouth with her hand, tears pricking her eyes. Another leaned toward the person beside him and muttered, "This can't be real." The judge struck his gavel again, his voice booming. "Enough!" Silence. Yet his own expression betrayed his turmoil. He was a man of the law, a servant of reason. But what was reason to make of this? All eyes turned to the dog. The German shepherd, who only minutes ago was the very picture of obedience and discipline, now lay on his back, wriggling joyfully at the girl's feet, begging for belly rubs like a playful puppy. His tail thudded against the polished wood floor in rapid, eager beats. The jurors stared in open disbelief. This was not the behavior of a canine officer trained to ignore distraction. This was recognition. This was love. The handler ran a hand through his hair, exhaling in frustration and confusion. "This doesn't happen," he muttered, shaking his head. "It just doesn't happen. He doesn't break training. Ever. He's never done this." His voice cracked slightly, betraying the part of him that was rattled, not just as an officer, but as a man who had just witnessed something unexplainable. The mother's hands shook as she stroked the dog's fur, her tears falling freely now. "We looked everywhere for you," she whispered, her voice breaking. "We thought you were gone forever." The little girl lifted her head, her eyes shining through her tears. She looked up at her mother, and then back at the courtroom, her voice high and clear. "I told you, Mommy. It's Buddy. He came back." No one moved. No one spoke. For a long moment, the only sounds were the girl's soft cries, the dog's happy whines, and the thumping of his tail against the floor. Finally, the judge leaned forward, his deep voice carrying through the room. "Officer," he said, addressing the handler, "is it possible this animal was previously a pet?" The handler swallowed hard, his throat tight. He looked down at the dog, who ignored him completely, still lavishing affection on the child. Slowly, he nodded. "It's possible," he admitted. "When we found him, he was wandering the streets. He had no collar, no tags. He was strong, intelligent, responsive to training. We brought him into the program. He was given a new name, new duties. But I've never seen him act like this with anyone." The courtroom buzzed again with murmurs, the tension mounting with every passing second. The idea seemed impossible, and yet the evidence was undeniable. A child had spoken a name no one in that room had known, and the dog had responded in a way that shattered years of training. One juror shook his head, muttering, "There's no way she could have guessed." "Not like that." Another leaned forward, whispering, "You can't fake that reaction. Look at him." The mother clutched her daughter tightly, tears still streaming down her face. She looked at the handler, desperation in her eyes. "Please," she said, her voice pleading, "you have to believe us. This is our dog. We loved him. We never stopped looking for him." The handler didn't respond immediately. He knelt slowly, hesitantly, beside the dog, trying to call him back to order. "Come," he commanded, his voice firm. But the German shepherd ignored him entirely. Instead, he pressed his head more firmly into the little girl's lap, as if choosing where he belonged. The handler's hands trembled as he withdrew. He looked up at the judge, his voice breaking. "Sir, I've served with this dog for 2 years. He's never disobeyed me. Never. Until now." The judge's gavel remained still. His eyes, thoughtful and troubled, lingered on the scene before him, the child, the dog, the mother, the stunned officer. Slowly, he leaned back in his chair, shaking his head slightly, as though wrestling with the weight of what he was witnessing. The silence was broken, only when the little girl buried her face in the dog's fur once more and whispered, "I missed you." The dog whimpered softly, pressing closer, his tail wagging like a metronome of joy. And in that moment, the disbelief that had hung heavy in the courtroom gave way to something else, something undeniable. Recognition. Every person in that room, whether they admitted it aloud or not, knew the truth. The bond between the child and the dog was real. The love pouring from them was not something that could be trained, not something that could be fabricated. It was the kind of connection that defied logic but demanded belief. For the first time in years, Buddy had found his way home. And for the first time in years, a courtroom full of strangers bore witness to a miracle. The courtroom, once shaken by the thunderclap of recognition, slowly fell into a stunned silence. Even the scratching of pens and the coughs of restless jurors had ceased. All eyes remained on the child, the mother, and the German shepherd who lay sprawled across the wooden floor as if he had finally come home. The judge, his expression unreadable, leaned back in his chair, his gavel resting untouched beside him. He had seen many extraordinary moments in his years of service, tears, confessions, and shocking twists, but nothing like this. What could a man of law say in the face of something that so thoroughly defied reason? The mother clutched her daughter's shoulders, steadying her trembling hands. Her voice cracked as she spoke, directing her words to the bench. "Your Honor, please. I know this must seem impossible, but I swear to you that dog is ours. His name is Buddy. He was part of our family." The handler, still crouched a few feet away, looked up sharply. His face was a storm of denial and doubt, but there was no disguising the unease in his eyes. "Ma'am, with respect," he said, his voice tight, "this dog has been in service for 2 years. He's not a pet. He's a trained canine officer. His name is Shadow." At the sound of that name, the German shepherd barely flicked an ear. But when the little girl sniffled, whispering again, "Buddy," the dog's head snapped toward her instantly, tail thudding against the floor. The gallery erupted with whispers once more. The judge's gavel struck down hard. "Quiet," he barked, the wood cracking against the block. Silence returned, but the tension was palpable, humming through the chamber like static before a storm. "Ma'am," the judge said slowly, his deep voice resonant, "you claim this animal belonged to your family. Explain to this court how he came to be lost." The mother swallowed hard, her eyes glistening as memories surfaced. She pulled her daughter close, as though steadying both of them with the story she was about to tell. "It was 2 years ago," she began softly. "We had just finished dinner. It was spring, I remember, because the air was warm and the lilacs in our yard had just bloomed. Buddy was in the backyard, chasing his favorite red ball." Her voice broke and she paused, taking a shuddering breath. "We thought it was just another evening. My daughter, only a baby then, laughed every time he ran to her with the ball in his mouth. She loved him more than anything. But then her throat tightened. She pressed her hand against her lips, her eyes filling. Then what?" The judge pressed gently, though his tone carried authority. The mother's voice cracked as she continued. "We heard him barking louder, sharper than usual. By the time we got outside, the gate was open. He was gone." A murmur spread across the room. The jurors shifted uncomfortably, exchanging glances. The mother wiped her tears quickly with the back of her hand. "We searched everywhere. We posted flyers. We called shelters, vets, the police. Weeks passed, then months. No trace. We thought," her voice faltered, "we thought he'd been taken. Or worse." The little girl buried her face against the dog's fur, as if remembering those empty nights without him. The shepherd nuzzled her, whining softly, as if understanding. The handler straightened, crossing his arms, his voice edged with defensiveness. "With respect, Your Honor, strays are found all the time. Dogs wander. People claim them. This isn't proof." The judge turned to him, his eyes narrowing. "Officer, describe the circumstances under which this dog was acquired by your unit." The handler hesitated, clearly uncomfortable with the scrutiny. He cleared his throat. 2 years ago, Animal Control found him roaming near an industrial park. No collar, no microchip. He was healthy, strong, responsive. He fit the profile for the program, so he was transferred to our training facility. We trained him, certified him, and assigned him to service. That's the whole story." The mother shook her head fiercely. "No, that's not the whole story. He didn't just wander. Someone took him. Someone opened our gate." Her voice rose, filled with anger and pain. "And now he's here, in front of us, and you can't deny what you've seen with your own eyes. He knows us. He remembers us. The jurors whispered again, their pens scratching furiously across notepads. Even the prosecutor, usually so composed, looked rattled. The judge studied the dog, who now sat obediently beside the child, his head resting on her lap, as though the years of separation had dissolved in an instant. Slowly, the judge leaned forward. "Tell me," he asked, his voice quieter now, "what makes you certain this is your dog? Beyond the name, beyond the behavior, is there something specific, something no one else would know?" The mother nodded, her eyes brimming with fresh tears. "Yes," she whispered. She reached out, her hand trembling, and gently lifted the dog's front paw. Turning it upward, she showed the court the underside. There, on the pad of his right paw, was a small, crescent-shaped scar. "It happened when he was just a puppy," she said, her voice quivering. "He cut his paw on a piece of glass in the yard. We rushed him to the vet. They stitched it up, but the scar never faded. We used to joke that it looked like a little moon. We called him our moon paw dog." A collective gasp filled the chamber. Jurors craned their necks to see, and the handler himself bent forward, his eyes widening in disbelief. I never noticed that," he stammered. The little girl reached down, stroking the scar with her tiny fingers. "See, Mommy? It's still there. It's Buddy." The courtroom was silent again, but it was no longer the silence of disbelief. It was the silence of truth settling heavily into every heart. The handler sank slowly into the nearest chair, his face pale, his composure shattered. He stared at the scar, then at the child, then at the dog, as if the foundation of his certainty had crumbled beneath him. The judge exhaled, rubbing his chin thoughtfully. His voice, when it came, was grave but not unkind. "It seems this court has stumbled into something beyond its usual scope. Officer, this matter will require further investigation. Until then, I cannot ignore what has unfolded here. The bond between this child and this animal is undeniable." The little girl hugged Buddy tightly, her sobs quiet now, replaced by soft giggles as the dog licked her cheek. For the first time in years, the emptiness in her heart had been filled. The mother closed her eyes, tears streaming freely, but this time they were tears of relief. After years of searching, after nights of despair, their missing family member was here alive, safe, and found in the most unlikely place. And the entire courtroom had witnessed the truth. A hidden connection had been revealed. The courtroom had never felt so small. The oak-paneled walls that once seemed grand now pressed inward, trapping a storm of emotions within. What should have been an ordinary day of legal proceedings had spiraled into something unthinkable. A lost family dog, now a decorated canine, was at the heart of an explosive battle between law and love. The German shepherd Buddy to some, Shadow to others, sat calmly at the center of the storm, his head resting in the lap of the little girl who refused to let him go. Her hands clutched his fur like an anchor, her face glowing with relief, even as tears clung stubbornly to her lashes. The dog's eyes, half-lidded with peace, showed no trace of the chaos unfolding around him. But for the humans, chaos reigned. The gallery buzzed with voices, whispers turning to murmurs, murmurs rising to heated commentary. "This is unbelievable. Did you see the scar? It's the same dog. Can they really take him from her again?" The judge's gavel thundered against the block, but it was as effective as rain against a wildfire. "Order! Order in the court!" His voice rang out, but the tension refused to be silenced. The prosecutor stood abruptly, her voice sharp, slicing through the commotion. "Your Honor, this outburst is irrelevant to the case before us. We cannot allow a child's claim, however emotional, to derail these proceedings." The defense attorney shot to his feet, his tone equally fierce. With respect, counsel, this is not just an emotional claim. We all witnessed the dog's reaction. That cannot be dismissed as coincidence. The prosecutor's face tightened. A reaction is not proof. Dogs are easily excitable. The court cannot be swayed by sentimentality. At that, the mother rose to her feet, her voice trembling but resolute. Don't you dare call this sentimentality. That is our dog. My daughter has cried for him every night since he disappeared. You didn't see how empty our home was without him. You didn't hear her asking where Buddy went. And now he's here, right in front of us. You can't deny the truth. Gasps and murmurs filled the room again. Some jurors shifted uncomfortably, their faces etched with sympathy. Others glanced toward the judge, as though silently begging for guidance. The handler finally broke his silence, his voice loud, firm, and filled with conflicted anger. With all due respect, Mom, you don't understand what you're saying. This dog is not just a pet. He's an officer. He's trained to serve, to protect, to put his life on the line for others. He's saved lives. He's not a backyard family dog anymore. He belongs to the force. The words struck like a blow, and for a moment, the mother's shoulders sagged under their weight. But then she straightened, her voice burning with conviction. And where was the force when he went missing? Where was the force when my daughter cried herself to sleep, clutching his empty collar? We raised him, we loved him, we cared for him before you ever put a badge on his neck. He's family. The little girl clutched Buddy tighter, her small voice carrying more weight than anyone expected. He's mine. He's not Shadow. He's Buddy. The courtroom froze. The simplicity of her words, spoken through tears, silenced the storm for a heartbeat. The child's claim was not legal, not logical, but it was powerful in a way no argument could be. The judge rubbed his temples, his patience fraying. Enough, he said, his voice low but firm. This is a court of law. I will not tolerate further disruption. However, his eyes flickered to the girl and the dog, then to the scar on the paw. It is clear this situation demands careful consideration. The prosecutor, seizing the moment, spoke again. Your Honor, we cannot allow this spectacle to undermine the trial. The dog is evidence, nothing more. His presence here was for demonstration only. The matter of ownership, if it is to be addressed, should be settled outside of this courtroom. The defense attorney leaned forward, his voice cool but firm. And yet, this courtroom is now the place where the truth has revealed itself. You can't unsee what we've all witnessed. You can't silence it. The handler slammed his fist lightly against the table, his composure slipping. This is madness. He's my partner. I've served with him day and night. He's risked his life for me. You can't just strip him away because a child says 2 words. The mother turned sharply toward him, her voice like steel. And you can't erase the years he spent with us before you ever knew his name. He was ours first. He is ours still. The gallery erupted again, torn between sympathy for the grieving family and respect for the officer who had clearly bonded with the dog. Voices clashed, echoing against the walls. She's right, it's her dog. No, the officer's right. He's a hero now. The judge pounded his gavel so hard it cracked against the block. Enough. If you cannot keep your composure, I will clear this courtroom. His voice boomed, finally silencing the crowd. For a long moment, the air was thick with unspoken tension. The dog lifted his head, looking first at the handler, then at the child, then back again. His eyes, dark and soulful, seemed to carry the weight of both worlds, the life of duty and discipline, and the life of warmth and family. He whined softly, as though torn between 2 masters, 2 homes. The judge exhaled slowly, his face solemn. This matter is no longer about demonstration. It is about identity. It is about truth. And truth will be sought properly. He turned to the bailiff. I want records pulled on this animal. Veterinary history, adoption records, every detail of his intake into the program. I also want the family's prior documentation photos, veterinary records, licensing. We will not proceed until this matter is investigated fully. The bailiff nodded and left swiftly. The courtroom, though quieter, still buzzed with energy, anger, hope, fear, disbelief. It was a powder keg waiting to explode again. The mother sank back into her seat, her arm around her daughter. Tears glistened in her eyes, but a fierce light burned there too. She had come face to face with the unthinkable, and she was not going to let Buddy slip away again. The handler sat heavily at his table, his jaw clenched, his fists tight. For the first time in years, he felt the ground beneath him shift. The dog he thought was his partner might never have been his at all. The little girl stroked Buddy's scarred paw, whispering softly into his fur. Don't worry. I won't let them take you again. Buddy pressed his head against her, his tail thumping quietly, as though making a vow of his own. The courtroom had become chaos. But beneath the noise, the truth had already begun to take root. And no gavel, no objection, no law could bury it again. The courtroom was hushed, its usual rhythm shattered. Hours had passed since the outburst that had sent everything spiraling, and in that time, the wheels of justice had turned in ways no one expected. The bailiff returned with stacks of papers, folders, and reports that would either confirm the mother's desperate claim or disprove it once and for all. The air was heavy with anticipation. Jurors sat stiffly in their seats, their pens resting uselessly on the paper before them. The prosecutor's face was tense, her jaw set tight, while the defense attorney leaned back with folded arms, as though he had been waiting for this moment all along. The mother sat with her daughter, pressed close against her side, one hand resting protectively on the German shepherd's back. The little girl clung to Buddy, as if the very act of holding him could keep him from being taken again. And Buddy, calm now, lay curled at their feet, his chest rising and falling with steady breaths. His loyalty seemed etched in stone. The handler, sitting a few feet away, stared down at his hands, his usual air of control stripped away. For 2 years, he had called this dog his partner. He had trusted him, leaned on him, believed in him. Now, that partnership stood on the edge of being redefined. The judge adjusted his glasses, his face unreadable, as he opened the file handed to him by the bailiff. He scanned the documents in silence, the only sound in the chamber the faint rustle of paper. Every eye was fixed on him, waiting, straining to interpret the flicker of his expression. Finally, he looked up. His voice was slow, deliberate, and heavy with meaning. This court has reviewed the records. The intake file from the K9 program states this animal was found wandering without identification 2 years ago. No tags, no collar, no microchip. The prosecutor nodded slightly, as though this confirmed her position. But the judge wasn't finished. However, his eyes shifted to the mother and child, his voice tightening. The family has provided veterinary records from the same period. These records documented German Shepherd male with a distinctive crescent-shaped scar on the underside of his right paw, identical to the scar this court has now seen. Photographs provided show the dog in question with this family prior to his disappearance. These records are consistent, credible, and verified by the veterinarian who treated the animal. A murmur rippled through the room. The jurors leaned in, some with tears glistening in their eyes. The judge continued, his tone firm. The evidence supports the family's claim. This dog, known to them as Buddy, was indeed their pet before his disappearance. It is not the court's place to determine how he became separated, but the fact remains, this is their dog. The mother gasped softly, her hands flying to her mouth. Tears spilled down her cheeks, and she clutched her daughter tighter. The little girl squealed with joy, burying her face into Buddy's fur. The dog wagged his tail as though he understood every word. But the judge's expression remained grave. This does not erase the service he has provided as a canine officer. The animal, under the name Shadow, has been part of law enforcement, trained to serve, and has undoubtedly saved lives. The handler's bond with him is real, and it must be respected. The handler's eyes glistened, his jaw working as he struggled to contain his emotions. For the first time, his voice cracked. He's been my partner, Your Honor. I don't know how to just let him go. The mother turned toward him, her face wet with tears, but softened by empathy. And he's been our family. My daughter's first word wasn't even mommy. It was Buddy. We thought he was gone forever. But he came back to us. How can I let him go again? The courtroom held its breath. Two truths stood at odds: the handler's duty and bond, and the family's love and history. The judge sighed deeply, folding his hands. Sometimes the law must look beyond statutes and into the heart of what is right. This is one of those times. He turned his gaze to the handler. Officer, this dog's identity cannot be disputed. He belonged to this family before his service. By rights, he is theirs. But I will not dismiss the bond you forged. Therefore, I will allow a transition and opportunity for you to say goodbye properly, and for this family to welcome him back into their home. This dog will return to his rightful family. The words fell like a gavel strike, final and undeniable. The gallery erupted, some in applause, some in tears, some simply in awe of what they had witnessed. The little girl screamed with joy, throwing her arms around Buddy's neck. You're coming home, she cried, her voice bubbling with laughter through her tears. Buddy barked once, a sharp, joyful sound, as if confirming it himself. The handler sat silently, his shoulders slumped, his eyes fixed on the dog. After a long moment, he rose to his feet and crossed the courtroom. The mother stiffened, protective, but the handler raised a hand gently. His voice was quiet, thick with emotion. I've called you Shadow for 2 years, he said softly, kneeling beside the dog. Buddy looked up at him, his ears twitching. You've been my partner. You've saved me more than once. And I'll never forget you. He reached out, stroking the dog's head. Buddy leaned into his touch for a moment, then turned back toward the child, tail wagging. The handler swallowed hard, forcing a small, bittersweet smile. But I can see where you belong. You were Buddy before you were ever Shadow. Go home, boy. The mother's tears flowed harder at his words. She reached out, placing a hand on his shoulder. Thank you, she whispered, for keeping him safe all this time. The handler nodded, blinking quickly as he stood. Take good care of him, he said, his voice low. He deserves it. The judge struck his gavel one final time. This court is adjourned. The people in the gallery rose, buzzing with excitement, their voices filled with awe. They had come expecting a trial, but they left having witnessed a story that defied belief. As the courtroom emptied, the little girl skipped happily beside her mother, Buddy trotting at her side. For the first time in 2 years, their family was whole again. The scar on his paw, once a mark of loss, was now a symbol of survival and reunion. The handler lingered at the doorway, watching them leave. His heart ached, but he smiled faintly. In his line of work, miracles were rare. But today, he had seen one with his own eyes. And as the heavy doors of the courtroom closed, the story of the dog who had lived 2 lives, Buddy and Shadow, would be told again and again, not as a tale of law, but as a testament to love, loyalty, and the extraordinary ways fate can bring us home.